Beloved brothers and sisters, today I want to speak to your heart with gentleness, with truth, and with the deep compassion of our loving God. Many of God's children desire to draw closer to Him through fasting, prayer, and devotion. Yet at the same time, they walk through seasons of physical weakness, medical treatment, and ongoing health challenges. And in those moments, a quiet question rises within the soul. Am I pleasing God if I cannot fast the way others do? I want you to know from the very beginning that our God is not a harsh master, but a loving Father. He is the one who formed your body with His own wisdom. He knows every cell, every breath, every condition, and every prescription you carry. The same God who calls us to pray and fast is also the God who provides wisdom, doctors, medicine, and care. His grace is not limited to the strong. It is perfected in weakness. Fasting was never meant to bring fear, guilt, or condemnation. It was meant to bring life. When fasting becomes a source of anxiety instead of intimacy, we must pause and listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit. God does not ask His children to harm the body that He calls His temple. He is more interested in your obedience than your endurance, more interested in your heart than your hunger. Some may think that taking medication is a sign of weak faith, but I tell you today, faith is trusting God enough to follow His wisdom. When you take medicine responsibly, with prayer and gratitude, you are not walking away from God, you are walking with Him. Grace does not demand that you ignore your health. Grace meets you in your condition and walks you forward step by step. Today, let us open our hearts to a deeper understanding of God's love. Let us learn that fasting is not about copying others, but about hearing God for ourselves. The Lord who leads one person to a full fast may lead another to a different path of devotion, and both can be equally pleasing in His sight. Your health journey is not a barrier to God's presence. It is a place where His grace can shine even brighter. Key point number 1 affirms a foundational truth that shapes how believers understand God, themselves, and the purpose of spiritual disciplines. God's heart is always toward life, healing, and restoration. This truth is not a poetic idea or a comforting slogan, but a consistent revelation woven through the entire story of faith. From the very beginning, God reveals Himself not as a destroyer of life, but as its author. Life flows from Him, is sustained by Him, and finds its ultimate meaning in Him. When God formed humanity, He breathed life into fragile dust, showing that life itself is sacred and intentional. This reveals that God does not delight in suffering for suffering's sake, nor does He find pleasure in human pain disguised as devotion. His heart moves instinctively toward healing, wholeness, and renewal, because these reflect His nature. When people consider fasting, sacrifice, or spiritual discipline, many unconsciously project onto God an image of harshness, as though He is watching to see how much pain His children can endure to prove their sincerity. Yet this view contradicts the way God consistently reveals His heart. Throughout sacred history, God intervenes not to break people, but to restore them. When humanity fell into brokenness, God did not abandon them to decay. Instead, He initiated a long journey of redemption. When people were enslaved, He led them into freedom. When they were sick, He revealed Himself as healer. When they were weary, He became their rest. Every movement of God flows in the direction of life, but not depletion, and restoration, not destruction. Understanding this truth changes how one approaches the body, health, and obedience. The body is not an enemy of the spirit. It is a vessel created by God and declared good. Weakness is not a moral failure, and illness is not a spiritual crime. God's heart recognizes the limitations of human flesh because He designed it. He knows the effects of disease, imbalance, and pain. He is not offended by frailty, He is drawn to it with compassion. This is why healing is not an exception in God's work, but a natural expression of His love. Healing restores what is broken, aligns with life, and reflects the original intention of creation. When believers wrestle with questions about fasting while on medication, this foundational truth must guide their understanding. If God's heart is toward life, then any spiritual practice that threatens life, stability, or healing must be approached with wisdom and humility. God does not contradict His own nature. He does not call someone to a practice that undermines the very restoration He is working to bring. Fasting, when rightly understood, is meant to bring clarity, dependence, and spiritual sensitivity, not physical harm. If it becomes a source of fear, guilt, or damage, then it has drifted from its original purpose. God's heart toward healing is not limited to miraculous moments. It extends to processes, seasons, and gradual restoration. Healing can come through prayer, through time, through rest, through treatment, and through medicine. These are not competing forces, but complementary expressions of grace. To accept help for the body is not to reject God's power. It is often to receive it through the means He provides. God's heart rejoices when His children are restored, regardless of the pathway that restoration takes. The method is secondary, life is primary. Restoration also includes the inner life. Guilt, fear, and condemnation are not tools God uses to draw people closer. They fracture the soul and distort faith. When someone believes that God is disappointed with them because they cannot fast in a certain way due to medical needs, that belief itself becomes a wound. God's heart moves to heal that wound. He desires to free His children from religious pressure that misrepresents His character. Obedience rooted in fear is not the obedience God seeks. He desires a relationship grounded in trust, where believers feel safe to be honest about their limits. This truth also teaches that God's commands are always aligned with His goodness. God does not issue instructions that ignore context, individuality, or well-being. He speaks personally, wisely, and lovingly. What brings life to one person in a season may bring harm to another, and God understands this fully. His heart does not operate on rigid formulas, but on relational wisdom. Restoration is not uniform, it is personal. Life with God is not about comparison, but about communion. When God looks at a person navigating illness, treatment, or long-term medication, He does not see disobedience. He sees a child in need of grace. His heart is not measuring their sacrifice, but supporting their journey. He walks with them through uncertainty, weakness, and slow healing. Restoration sometimes means learning to live faithfully within limitations, trusting that God's presence is not diminished by physical constraints. Life, in God's eyes, includes peace, stability, and hope, not just endurance. This understanding liberates believers from false spiritual expectations. It allows them to approach fasting, prayer, and devotion not as burdens, but as invitations. When life and healing are the guiding principles, spiritual practices become life-giving rather than draining. They become expressions of trust rather than tests of worthiness. God's heart remains constant even when human capacity fluctuates. Ultimately, believing that God's heart is always toward life, healing, and restoration reshapes faith at its core. It reveals a God who is near, gentle, and deeply invested in the well-being of His people. It assures believers that their health journey is not a detour from spirituality, but a place where God is actively present. It invites them to walk honestly, listen carefully, and trust deeply, knowing that every step toward wholeness aligns with the very heart of God, who gives life and restores all things. Key point number 2 reminds us that fasting is a spiritual discipline, not a burden or a test of suffering, and this distinction is vital for a healthy and life-giving faith. Throughout spiritual history, fasting has often been misunderstood, sometimes elevated as a measure of spiritual strength or used as a silent competition of endurance. When this happens, fasting slowly shifts from being a means of drawing closer to God into a heavy obligation that weighs on the conscience. Instead of producing humility, it produces pressure. Instead of awakening intimacy, it awakens fear. This distortion does not come from God, because God never designed spiritual disciplines to crush the human soul or damage the human body. A discipline, by its nature, is something that trains, shapes, and aligns a person toward a greater purpose. It is never meant to punish. When fasting is understood correctly, it becomes a posture of surrender rather than self-inflicted hardship. It is an act of listening more than striving, of creating space rather than proving worth. The heart of fasting is not hunger, but dependence. The physical aspect is simply a tool, not the focus. When suffering becomes the focus, the discipline loses its spiritual essence and becomes something God never intended. Many believers unconsciously believe that the more uncomfortable a spiritual act is, the more pleasing it must be to God. This belief creates an unhealthy spiritual mindset where pain is confused with holiness. Yet God has never equated suffering with righteousness in such a simplistic way. While life inevitably includes suffering, God does not demand it as evidence of devotion. He does not measure love by how much a person hurts themselves for Him. True devotion is measured by obedience, humility, and trust, not by physical strain. Fasting, when practiced in grace, sharpens spiritual awareness. It quiets distractions and reminds the soul of its true source. But when practiced as a burden, it does the opposite. It fills the mind with anxiety, self-monitoring, and comparison. A person begins to ask whether they are fasting enough, fasting correctly, or fasting as long as others. This mindset shifts attention away from God and places it on performance. A spiritual discipline that was meant to free the heart becomes a source of internal bondage. God's intention is never to burden His children with impossible expectations. He understands human limitations because He created them. A loving father does not give his child a responsibility that will harm them, then watch silently as they struggle. In the same way, God does not call His children to practices that break them physically or emotionally. Spiritual disciplines exist to support life with God, not to replace grace with pressure. When fasting becomes a test of suffering, it ceases to be an expression of love and becomes a distortion of faith. This understanding is especially important for those navigating health challenges or medical treatment. When fasting is viewed as a burden, individuals on medication may feel torn between caring for their bodies and pleasing God. This inner conflict produces guilt and fear, neither of which come from God. If fasting were truly a test of suffering, then those who cannot endure it physically would feel excluded from spiritual depth. But God never designed intimacy to be reserved for the physically strong. His presence is equally near to the weak, the ill, and the exhausted. Spiritual disciplines are meant to be life-giving pathways, not universal molds that every believer must force themselves into regardless of circumstance. God works relationally, not mechanically. He speaks to individuals, not formulas. What deepens one person's faith in a particular season may harm another. A discipline that is healthy in one context can become damaging in another if applied without wisdom. This is why fasting must always be guided by discernment, prayer, and an honest awareness of one's physical and emotional condition. When fasting is practiced as a discipline rather than a burden, it remains flexible and compassionate. It can take different forms. It can be adapted without losing its spiritual value. The power of fasting does not lie in its intensity, but in its sincerity. God responds to the heart that seeks Him, not to the body that suffers the most. A small, wise act of devotion offered in faith is more pleasing than a painful act driven by fear or obligation. God never invites His children into spiritual practices to watch them struggle alone. He walks with them, guides them, and reassures them. When fasting is done in alignment with God's heart, it brings peace even in discomfort. When it is done as a burden, it brings restlessness even in achievement. The presence or absence of peace often reveals whether a discipline is being practiced in grace or under pressure. Understanding fasting as a discipline rather than a burden frees believers from unnecessary condemnation. It allows them to approach God honestly without pretending to be stronger than they are. It encourages them to listen to the Holy Spirit rather than external expectations. It restores the joy of devotion and removes the fear of falling short. When fasting flows from love instead of obligation, it becomes a gentle act of alignment rather than a harsh test of endurance. God's desire has always been relationship, not ritual. Disciplines serve that relationship, they do not replace it. When fasting supports intimacy, it fulfills its purpose. When it becomes a measure of suffering, it loses its meaning. A loving God does not delight in burdened obedience, but in willing hearts that trust Him enough to follow His leading with wisdom, humility, and peace. Key point number 3 emphasizes a truth that brings great comfort and balance to the life of faith. God understands the weakness and limits of the human body. This understanding is essential because many believers struggle with the idea that spiritual devotion requires ignoring physical reality. They feel tension between what they desire to do for God and what their bodies are capable of sustaining. Yet God is never surprised by human limitation. He is not frustrated by frailty, nor does He interpret weakness as a lack of sincerity. He designed the human body with intention, boundaries, rhythms, and needs, and His expectations are always shaped by that knowledge. From the moment humanity was created, limitation was part of the design. Human beings were formed from dust, animated by divine breath, meaning that strength and vulnerability have always coexisted. God never expected humanity to function as something other than human. Hunger, fatigue, illness, and the need for rest are not failures of faith. They are realities of embodiment. God understands this because He authored it. When people experience physical weakness, they are not stepping outside of God's design, but living within it. Many people subconsciously believe that God relates primarily to the spirit and is impatient with the body. This belief creates guilt whenever physical limitations interfere with spiritual intentions. Yet this idea does not reflect God's character. God is deeply aware of the body's condition. He sees exhaustion before it is spoken. He knows pain before it is diagnosed. He understands chemical imbalances, chronic conditions, and the side effects of treatment. Nothing about the human body is hidden from Him. He does not require explanations for weakness because He already knows its source. This truth reshapes how believers interpret obedience. Obedience is not about forcing the body to comply with spiritual desire at any cost. It is about aligning the whole person with God's wisdom. When the body reaches its limits, God is not offended. He is attentive. He does not demand what would cause harm. Instead, he invites trust, discernment, and humility. Recognizing limitation is not spiritual compromise, it is spiritual honesty. God's understanding of human weakness is also evident in how he responds to people throughout sacred history. He repeatedly shows patience with human fragility. When people were overwhelmed, he provided rest. When they were hungry, he provided nourishment. When they were sick, he brought healing or relief. He did not shame them for their condition, he met them within it. This reveals that God does not expect his children to transcend physical reality to be faithful. He meets them within the reality they are living. The idea that spiritual devotion requires constant strength creates a distorted image of God. It suggests that God values output more than well-being. Yet God's concern has always been holistic. He cares about the heart, the mind, and the body together. Weakness in one area does not cancel faithfulness in another. A person can be deeply devoted while physically limited. God does not measure devotion by stamina, but by sincerity. This understanding is especially important for those living with ongoing health conditions. Chronic illness often brings unpredictability, fatigue, and dependence on medication. These realities can make traditional expressions of devotion feel inaccessible. Without a proper understanding of God's compassion, individuals may internalize shame, believing they are falling short spiritually. But God does not see chronic weakness as a spiritual deficiency. He sees perseverance, trust, and courage in the midst of limitation. God's awareness of human limits also means that he does not compare one person's capacity with another's. Each body carries a different story. Some are strong in one season and weak in another. Some carry invisible burdens that others never see. God does not apply a single standard without regard for context. His guidance is personal, responsive, and compassionate. What he invites one person to do may not be what he invites another to do, and this difference is not favoritism but wisdom. When believers accept that God understands their physical limits, they are freed from unnecessary pressure. They no longer feel the need to pretend strength they do not have. They can approach God honestly without masking pain or fatigue. This honesty deepens relationship because it is rooted in truth rather than performance. God desires truth in the inward being, not a display of endurance that hides suffering. God's understanding also means that rest is not a spiritual failure. Rest is part of how the body heals and how the soul remains responsive. Ignoring the body's signals in the name of spirituality can lead to burnout, resentment, and disillusionment. God does not ask for such sacrifice. He invites rhythms that sustain life over time. He knows that long-term faithfulness requires care, balance, and self-awareness. The recognition of human limitation also invites believers to trust God beyond their own strength. Weakness becomes a place where dependence deepens. When the body cannot carry the weight of expectation, the soul learns to lean more fully on grace. This dependence is not something God despises, it is something he welcomes. It shifts faith from self-effort to trust, from control to surrender. Understanding that God knows and respects human limits transforms how spiritual disciplines are practiced. They become adaptable rather than rigid, responsive rather than demanding. The focus moves from completing a task to maintaining connection. Devotion becomes something that fits within life, rather than something that competes with health. This alignment reflects God's heart because he never intended spiritual life to be lived in opposition to physical reality. Ultimately, acknowledging that God understands the weakness and limits of the human body restores peace to the believer's heart. It assures them that they are not disappointing God by being human. It affirms that God's love is not conditional on physical performance. It allows faith to breathe, grow, and mature within the real conditions of life. This truth invites believers to walk with God as they are, trusting that He sees, understands, and lovingly supports them at every point of their journey. Key point number 4 affirms a deeply reassuring truth for many believers who wrestle with guilt and uncertainty. Medication is not a lack of faith, but often a provision of grace. This understanding corrects a harmful misconception that has caused unnecessary suffering for countless people who sincerely desire to trust God yet depend on medical treatment. Faith and medicine are often presented as opposites, as though choosing one means rejecting the other. But this division does not reflect the character of God or the reality of how grace operates in human life. Faith is not denial of reality, it is trust in God within reality. When a person takes medication, they are not declaring that God is powerless. They are acknowledging that God works through many channels. Grace is not limited to moments that feel supernatural or dramatic. Grace flows quietly through wisdom, knowledge, care, and provision. Medicine exists because human understanding has grown, and that growth itself is not separate from God's generosity. Knowledge that preserves life, reduces suffering, and restores balance reflects God's desire for wholeness rather than standing in opposition to it. The idea that taking medication signals weak faith often comes from a misunderstanding of what faith truly is. Faith is not measured by how little help one accepts, but by whom one ultimately trusts. A person may take medicine daily and still depend fully on God for strength, peace, healing, and direction. Trusting God does not mean rejecting every form of assistance. It means recognizing God as the source behind every good provision. When someone prays over their medication, they are not diminishing faith. They are integrating faith into their daily reality. God has always worked through means. Throughout history, healing and provision often came through tangible actions and processes rather than instant transformation. Food sustained the hungry, rest restored the weary, guidance protected the vulnerable. None of these diminished God's involvement. In the same way, medicine can be an instrument through which God sustains life and restores function. Grace does not always remove the need for treatment. Sometimes grace provides the treatment itself. Medication often carries a heavy emotional burden for believers. Some feel ashamed that they need it. Others fear judgment from those who equate faith with visible strength. This pressure can lead people to stop treatment prematurely or hide their condition, putting their health at risk. Such outcomes do not honor God. A faith that endangers life through fear is not faith rooted in love. God does not desire His children to suffer silently to prove devotion. He desires them to live, heal, and grow. Taking medication responsibly requires humility, not weakness. It acknowledges that the human body is complex and that healing is sometimes a process rather than an event. This humility aligns closely with faith or control all outcomes. Trusting God while following medical guidance is not double-mindedness. It is wisdom shaped by dependence on God. It is also important to understand that medication and prayer are not competing responses to illness. Prayer addresses the whole person, bringing peace, hope, and spiritual strength. Medication addresses specific physical needs. Together, they support holistic well-being. When believers separate these, they reduce the fullness of God's care. Grace does not ask people to choose between spiritual trust and physical responsibility. It invites them to embrace both with discernment. The belief that medication reflects a lack of faith often creates a hierarchy of spirituality that God never established. It suggests that those who are healed without treatment are more faithful than those who are healed through long-term care. This comparison is harmful and inaccurate. It suggests that those who are healed without treatment are more faithful than those who are healed through long-term care. This comparison is harmful and inaccurate. God's love is not distributed based on outcomes. Healing that is gradual is not inferior to healing that is immediate. Faithfulness is not measured by the method through which restoration occurs. Medication can also be part of a longer journey where God is working in layers rather than instant resolution. Some conditions require ongoing management rather than complete removal. In such cases, grace appears not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as daily stability, clarity of mind, and the ability to live meaningfully. This form of grace is no less divine. It sustains life over time and allows individuals to continue serving, loving, and growing. For many, medication provides the physical stability needed to engage fully in spiritual life. It enables focus, emotional balance, and physical strength. Without it, prayer becomes difficult, concentration fades, and daily life becomes overwhelming. If medication helps a person remain present, peaceful, and responsive to God, then it serves spiritual life rather than undermining it. God's grace supports whatever leads to life and connection. Recognizing medication as a provision of grace also frees believers from fear-driven decisions. It allows them to approach health choices with prayerful wisdom rather than spiritual panic. It encourages honest conversations with God about fears, hopes, and limitations. It replaces secrecy with openness and shame with acceptance. When people stop viewing medication as spiritual failure, they begin to experience God's compassion more deeply. Grace does not demand perfection, it provides support. It does not shame the dependent, it carries them. God's grace meets people in hospitals, clinics, pharmacies, and quiet moments of daily routine. It is present in the discipline of taking care of the body, just as it is present in prayer and worship. Faith that recognizes this becomes more mature, grounded, and resilient. Ultimately, understanding that medication is not a lack of faith, but a provision of grace restores balance to spiritual life. It allows believers to trust God without rejecting the help He provides. It affirms that caring for the body is not unspiritual, but responsible. It reassures the heart that God's love does not fluctuate with health status or treatment plans. This truth invites believers to walk forward without guilt, knowing that grace supports them not only in moments of miracle, but also in the quiet, faithful act of sustaining life day by day. Key point number 5 expresses a truth that restores balance to spiritual understanding. Obedience to wisdom is as spiritual as sacrifice. Many people have been taught, directly or indirectly, that spirituality is proven primarily through what one gives up, endures, or suffers. Sacrifice is often viewed as the highest expression of devotion, while wisdom is sometimes treated as secondary, practical, or even unspiritual. Yet this separation is artificial and misleading. True spirituality does not pit wisdom against sacrifice. Instead, it recognizes that obedience to wise guidance is itself a sacred act that honors God deeply. Wisdom is not a human alternative to faith. It is one of the primary ways God leads His people. Wisdom flows from God's understanding of reality, timing, consequence, and purpose. When someone obeys wisdom, they are not choosing convenience over devotion. They are choosing alignment with God's perspective rather than acting from impulse, pressure, or fear. Obedience to wisdom often requires more faith than visible sacrifice, because it demands trust without applause and humility without recognition. Sacrifice is visible. Wisdom is often quiet. Sacrifice can be admired by others, while wisdom is frequently misunderstood. This is why some believers struggle to value wisdom properly. They fear that choosing what is prudent will be interpreted as a lack of zeal or commitment. But God does not evaluate devotion based on appearance. He looks at motive alignment and outcome. A sacrifice that ignores wisdom may look impressive, but it can lead to harm, burnout, or unintended damage. God is not glorified by outcomes that contradict life, peace, and sustainability. Obedience to wisdom requires listening rather than striving. It requires patience instead of urgency. In many cases, wisdom tells a person to pause when their emotions urge them to push harder. It may instruct them to care for their body when pride demands endurance. It may guide them to modify a spiritual practice rather than intensify it. These moments are not spiritual compromises. They are moments of deep obedience, where trust is placed in God's guidance rather than in personal effort. God has always valued wisdom as a spiritual virtue. Wisdom reflects discernment, humility, and reverence. It acknowledges that God sees more than the individual does. When someone chooses wisdom, they are admitting that their understanding is limited and that God's direction is superior. This posture is profoundly spiritual. It mirrors the heart of obedience that God desires, where actions flow from trust rather than self-proving effort. Sacrifice without wisdom can become dangerous. It can slowly transform devotion into self-punishment. When people believe that God is most pleased by how much they give up, they may ignore warning signs in their body, mind, or spirit. They may override conscience, medical advice, or inner peace to meet an external standard. Over time, this approach can produce resentment, exhaustion, and disillusionment. God does not require this kind of devotion. He does not ask his children to sacrifice discernment in order to demonstrate faithfulness. Wisdom does not eliminate sacrifice, it refines it. Wise obedience may still involve giving something up, but it does so in a way that preserves life and purpose. A wise sacrifice builds rather than destroys. It strengthens relationship rather than weakening it. It leaves room for growth rather than collapse. When sacrifice is guided by wisdom, it becomes sustainable and life-giving, not dramatic and damaging. This principle is especially important in matters of health, fasting, and physical limitation. When wisdom says that the body needs nourishment, rest, or medication, obeying that wisdom is not a lesser form of spirituality. It is an act of reverence for the life God has given. Ignoring wisdom in these situations does not elevate faith, it distorts it. God does not ask for sacrifices that contradict care, and he does not reward actions that disregard the body he designed. Obedience to wisdom also protects believers from comparison. Sacrificial acts are easily measured against others, but wisdom is personal and contextual. What is wise for one person in a season may not be wise for another. God's guidance takes into account capacity, timing, and purpose. When believers honor wisdom, they are freed from the pressure to imitate others' sacrifices. They learn to listen for God's voice rather than public expectation. There is also courage in choosing wisdom. It often requires standing against misunderstanding or judgment. Others may not see the spiritual value of restraint, moderation, or adaptation. They may mistake wisdom for compromise. Yet obedience is not about being understood by people. It is about being aligned with God. When someone chooses wisdom despite external pressure, they demonstrate a mature faith that values God's approval over human perception. Wisdom-centered obedience also fosters long-term faithfulness. Sacrifice driven by intensity can burn brightly but briefly. Wisdom sustains devotion over time. It allows a person to walk with God through seasons of strength and seasons of weakness without collapsing under unrealistic expectations. God is interested in lifelong relationship, not short-lived displays of zeal. Obedience that endures is rooted in wisdom, understanding that obedience to wisdom is as spiritual as sacrifice transforms how believers approach decision-making. They stop viewing careful choices as lesser acts of faith and begin to see them as expressions of trust. They learn that God is honored not only when something is given up, but also when something is preserved. Protecting health, stability, and peace can be just as sacred as laying something down. This truth invites believers into a more mature spirituality, one that integrates devotion with discernment. It replaces fear-driven sacrifice with trust-filled obedience. It affirms that God is glorified when His children listen, adapt, and act wisely. Obedience that flows from wisdom reflects a deep confidence that God's guidance is good, His intentions are life-giving, and His ways lead not to harm but to wholeness. Key point number 6 reveals a truth that protects the heart of faith from becoming harsh and misdirected. God desires mercy, not harm to the body He created. This truth speaks directly to how God views devotion, discipline, and sacrifice. It reminds believers that God's desire has never been for His children to damage themselves in an attempt to please Him. Mercy, not harm, reflects God's character. Compassion, not cruelty, defines His will. When spiritual practices drift toward causing physical or emotional injury, they move away from God's heart rather than closer to it. The body is not an obstacle to spirituality. It is part of God's intentional design. God created the human body with care, complexity, and purpose. Every system, every function, every limit exists by divine wisdom. To harm the body in the name of devotion is to misunderstand both devotion and God. God does not despise the physical form. He declared it good. He does not ask His children to violate their own well-being to prove loyalty. Mercy honors creation, while harm contradicts it. Throughout faith history, God consistently corrects religious expressions that prioritize ritual over compassion. When religious practices become rigid and unfeeling, God intervenes to redirect hearts back to mercy. He shows that obedience without compassion is incomplete. Harm done in the name of holiness is not holiness at all. God's desire for mercy reveals that love is the foundation of every command, and care is the measure of true faithfulness. Harm can take many forms. It is not limited to visible injury. Harm can be physical exhaustion pushed beyond safe limits, emotional pressure driven by guilt, or spiritual anxiety caused by fear of displeasing God. When people believe God is pleased by their suffering, they may ignore warning signs within themselves. They may silence pain, dismiss medical advice, or override inner peace to maintain an appearance of devotion. This mindset does not come from God. It grows from misunderstanding His heart. God's desire for mercy means He is attentive to how practices affect the whole person. He cares not only about intention, but also about impact. A practice that damages health, stability, or peace cannot reflect God's will. Even if it appears religious, God's commands are life-giving. When something consistently produces harm, it requires re-evaluation. Mercy invites discernment. It asks whether a practice is drawing a person closer to God or pushing them into fear and depletion. The body carries God's fingerprint. To treat it carelessly is not an act of faith, but a neglect of stewardship. God entrusts life to each person, not as something to be tested until it breaks, but as something to be cared for responsibly. Mercy toward the body acknowledges that life is precious. It recognizes that God's presence is not increased by suffering inflicted unnecessarily. God is not glorified by damage done to what He lovingly formed. Many believers struggle with guilt when physical needs limit their spiritual expression. They feel torn between devotion and self-care, as though choosing care means choosing less faith. But God does not ask for this conflict. Mercy resolves it. Mercy affirms that tending to the body is not disobedience, but alignment with God's concern for life. When someone rests, nourishes themselves, or follows treatment, they are not rejecting spirituality. They are honoring the vessel through which spiritual life is lived. God's desire for mercy also protects believers from judgment toward themselves and others. When harm is mistaken for holiness, comparison becomes inevitable. People begin measuring devotion by visible endurance rather than inner faithfulness. Those who cannot keep up due to illness, age, or limitation may feel inferior or excluded. Mercy dismantles this hierarchy. It declares that God's love is not reserved for the strongest bodies or the longest fasts. Mercy makes room for every condition, every season, and every capacity. Spiritual practices are meant to cultivate love, humility, and trust. When they produce fear, shame, or harm, they need correction. God's desire for mercy means He values the heart's posture more than the body's strain. He listens to intention, not intensity. He responds to sincerity, not severity. A gentle act offered in love is more pleasing to Him than a harsh act driven by fear of falling short. Mercy also recognizes that human strength fluctuates. Bodies change over time. Seasons of health and seasons of weakness come and go. God does not demand the same expression of devotion in every season. What honors Him is responsiveness to His guidance in the present moment. Mercy allows faith to adapt without losing depth. It supports long-term relationship rather than short-term performance. Harmful spirituality often grows from the belief that God must be impressed. Mercy reveals that God is already moved by love. He is not persuaded by pain. He is not closer because someone suffers more. He is close because He loves. When believers understand this, that their faith softens, they stop striving to earn approval and begin resting in acceptance. This rest does not weaken devotion, it purifies it. God's desire for mercy invites believers to listen carefully to both the spirit and the body. The body often communicates limits that require attention. Ignoring these signals does not make someone more spiritual. Wisdom and mercy work together to preserve life. God's guidance never contradicts care. When He leads someone into a discipline, He also provides grace to sustain it. When He leads someone to pause or adjust, that guidance is equally holy. Understanding that God desires mercy, not harm to the body He created, restores trust in God's goodness. It assures believers that God is not watching for failure, but walking with compassion. It frees them from fear-driven devotion and replaces it with love-centered obedience. It allows them to approach God honestly, without hiding weakness or pretending strength. This truth reshapes faith into something gentle yet strong, disciplined yet compassionate, devoted yet deeply human, reflecting a God whose love always moves toward healing, care, and life. Key point number 7 affirms a truth that brings peace to the tension many believers feel between spirituality and physical care. Faith and medical care can walk together in harmony. This truth gently corrects the idea that trusting God and seeking medical help are opposing paths. In reality, faith and medical care are not rivals competing for authority over the human body. When rightly understood, they function as partners, each addressing different dimensions of human life, while ultimately serving the same purpose, which is wholeness. Faith speaks to trust, hope, meaning, and relationship with God. Medical care speaks to diagnosis, treatment, stability, and physical restoration. These two are not mutually exclusive because human beings are not one-dimensional. A person is spiritual, emotional, and physical all at once. God does not compartmentalize human life, and neither should faith. When faith is isolated from physical reality, it becomes abstract and disconnected. When medical care is isolated from faith, it can feel mechanical and empty. Harmony emerges when both are allowed to function together. Under God's wisdom, many conflicts between faith and medicine arise from fear rather than truth. Some fear that relying on doctors diminishes trust in God. Others fear that faith discourages responsible health decisions. These fears grow when faith is defined as denial instead of trust. True faith does not require rejecting tools that preserve life. It requires trusting God as the ultimate source behind every good thing, including knowledge, skill, and care. When a believer prays before a medical appointment, they are not shifting allegiance. They are inviting God into the process. God's involvement does not end when human action begins. He works through people, systems, and processes. The presence of medical professionals does not remove God from the equation. It often reflects His provision. The compassion of caregivers, the development of treatments, and the discipline of research are expressions of God's concern for human suffering. Faith recognizes God's hand not only in miracles, but also in means. Harmony between faith and medical care requires humility. It acknowledges that human understanding is limited and that healing can take many forms. Sometimes healing is immediate. Sometimes it is gradual. Sometimes it involves management rather than complete resolution. Faith remains active in all these scenarios. It sustains hope when progress is slow and anchors the heart when outcomes are uncertain. Medical care addresses what can be treated, while faith addresses what must be trusted. This harmony also protects believers from extremes. When faith rejects medical care entirely, it risks turning trust into presumption. When medical care ignores faith entirely, it risks turning healing into a purely technical exercise devoid of meaning. Balance allows each to function without overstepping its role. Faith does not replace medical care, and medical care does not replace faith. Together, they support the whole person. For individuals living with long-term conditions, this harmony is especially important. Ongoing treatment can feel discouraging if viewed as a sign that faith has failed. But when faith and medicine are seen as walking together, treatment becomes part of a faithful journey rather than a detour from it. Daily medication, regular checkups, and lifestyle adjustments can be infused with prayer, gratitude, and trust. Faith transforms routine care into an act of stewardship rather than resignation. Harmony also brings emotional relief. Many believers experience internal conflict when they feel pressured to choose between spiritual devotion and physical responsibility. This conflict can lead to anxiety, secrecy, or neglect. When faith and medical care are reconciled, the heart settles. Decisions no longer feel like betrayals of belief. Instead, they become expressions of trust in a God who cares about both soul and body. God does not ask His children to navigate illness alone. He provides support through community, wisdom through professionals, and strength through faith. Rejecting one form of help in the name of another misunderstands God's generosity. Harmony honors the fullness of His provision. It recognizes that God's care is layered, relational, and practical. This truth also encourages compassion within faith communities. When faith and medical care are seen as compatible, judgment loses its power. People are no longer measured by whether they sought treatment or how quickly they recovered. Instead, they are supported in their journey. This creates space for honesty, vulnerability, and mutual care. Communities become places of healing rather than pressure. Harmony does not mean blind acceptance of every option. Faith still calls for discernment. Medical advice must be weighed carefully, prayed over, and applied wisely. Faith does not silence questions, it frames them. It encourages seeking understanding rather than reacting in fear. This thoughtful engagement reflects maturity, not doubt. When faith and medical care walk together, fear diminishes. Fear thrives on extremes, but peace grows in balance. Trusting God does not mean abandoning responsibility. Caring for the body does not mean abandoning prayer. Each reinforces the other. Faith gives meaning to treatment. Treatment provides stability for faith to flourish. This harmony also reflects God's original intention for humanity. God created people to live fully, not fragmented. He desires alignment, not conflict. When faith and medical care cooperate, life becomes more integrated. Decisions are made with both wisdom and trust. Challenges are faced with both action and prayer. Understanding this truth frees believers from false choices. It allows them to walk forward confidently, knowing they are not compromising faith by caring for their health. It reassures them that God is present in hospital rooms, clinics, and daily routines just as much as in moments of prayer and worship. Faith does not retreat when medicine enters the picture. It walks alongside it, steady and grounded, guiding the heart while the body receives care, reflecting a God who values wholeness, balance, and life. Key point number 8 centers on a deeply personal and comforting truth. The Holy Spirit guides each believer personally. This truth releases faith from rigid formulas and restores relationship to the center of spiritual life. God does not lead his people as a crowd driven by uniform rules, but as individuals known, seen, and understood. The Holy Spirit is not distant or generic in his guidance. He is present, attentive, and intimately aware of each person's condition, capacity, and season. Personal guidance is not a spiritual privilege reserved for a few. It is a gift given to every believer who seeks God with sincerity. Personal guidance means that God does not speak in abstractions. He speaks into real lives with real circumstances. The Holy Spirit understands the full context of a person's life, including their physical health, emotional state, responsibilities, and limitations. Guidance is shaped by this knowledge. What the Spirit leads one person to do may look very different from what he leads another to do, even when both are faithful and sincere. This does not create confusion, it creates freedom. It allows faith to be lived authentically rather than performatively. Many believers struggle because they assume that spiritual obedience must look the same for everyone. They measure their faith against others and feel pressure to imitate practices that may not be wise or life-giving for them. This comparison often leads to guilt or fear, especially when physical health or emotional capacity differs. The truth that the Holy Spirit guides personally dismantles this pressure. It reminds believers that God's voice to them matters, not as an exception, but as the primary source of direction. The Holy Spirit's personal guidance is rooted in relationship, not rules. He does not issue commands without care. He does not push people beyond what they can bear. He leads with patience and wisdom. Sometimes his guidance invites action, and sometimes it invites rest. Sometimes it calls for discipline, and sometimes it calls for gentleness. Both are equally spiritual when they come from God's voice. Personal guidance ensures that obedience is responsive rather than rigid. This truth is especially important in areas where spiritual practices intersect with physical health. Fasting, prayer, and devotion are not one-size-fits-all expressions. The Holy Spirit knows how these practices affect each person uniquely. He understands when a certain practice will bring clarity and when it will bring harm. Listening to His guidance protects believers from blindly following expectations that may not align with their well-being. Obedience to personal guidance honors God more than conformity to external standards.